In 1986, a dairy farmer in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, was fined $4,500 for doing exactly what his family had done since 1923. He was selling raw milk to his neighbors. His grandfather sold it from the same barn, the same herd, the same stainless steel cans. Nobody ever got sick, but the state said he was breaking the law. Number 11 on this list was practiced by every single rural household in America for over 200 years. It is now a misdemeanor in most states. Number 6 was so effective that chemical companies lobbied state legislatures to outlaw it. These 20 farmhouse tricks were not banned because they were dangerous. They were banned because they were free. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 20 old farmhouse tricks that got quietly outlawed across America. Number 20, selling raw milk from the farm gate. Farm gate, raw milk sales restricted. Your grandfather walked to the barn at 5 a.m., milked the cows by hand, strained the milk through cheesecloth, and sold it to neighbors in glass bottles they brought themselves. No pasteurization, no homogenization, no middleman. A gallon cost about 35 cents in 1960, and it tasted nothing like the flat blue-white liquid in today's plastic jugs. It was thick, rich, with a layer of cream that rose to the top overnight. Families would skim that cream for butter and coffee and drink the rest cold with supper. Millions of Americans grew up on this milk without a single issue, but starting in the 1980s, state after state began outlawing or severely restricting raw milk sales. By 2024, the sale of raw milk directly to consumers is illegal or heavily regulated in 38 states. The FDA has spent decades campaigning against it, citing bacterial risks. But here is the part they leave out. Before pasteurization became mandatory, farm families who drank their own raw milk from healthy grass-fed cows had remarkably low rates of lactose intolerance and allergies. European studies published in the Journal of Allergy and Clinical Immunology found that children who grew up drinking farm-fresh raw milk were 40% less likely to develop asthma. The dairy industry did not outlaw raw milk because it was unsafe. They outlawed it because you did not need them to process it. Number 19, rendering lard at home for sale. After hog slaughter, every farmhouse kitchen had a cast iron pot on the stove, rendering leaf fat into pure white lard. The fat was cut into small cubes, melted slowly over low heat, and strained through muslin into crocks that lasted all winter. That lard went into pie crusts, biscuits, fried chicken, and soap. Neighbors who did not raise hogs bought it by the pound. A farm wife could sell 40 pounds of lard after a single slaughter and fund the family's seed purchase for spring. Then, food safety regulations caught up. State health departments began requiring commercial licensing, facility inspections, and USDA-approved processing for anyone selling rendered animal fats. The licensing fees alone could run from $500 to $2,000 a year, more than most small farmers earned from lard sales in a decade. Crisco had been pushing vegetable shortening since 1911, and by the 1990s, the regulatory landscape made it nearly impossible for a farm kitchen to compete. We replaced the cleanest cooking fat in America with hydrogenated soybean oil. Cardiologists spent 30 years telling us that was progress. The trans fat ban that followed proved it was not. Number 18, burning household trash in a barrel. Every rural property in America had a burn barrel sitting 50 feet from the back door. A 55-gallon steel drum with holes punched near the bottom for airflow. Paper, cardboard, food scraps, broken furniture, anything that would catch a flame went in. Your grandfather lit it once a week, usually Saturday morning, and stood there with a coffee mug watching the smoke curl up through the tree line. There was no garbage truck coming down a dirt road in 1965. There was no municipal dump within 30 miles. The burn barrel was the only waste management system rural America had. Starting in the late 1980s and accelerating through the 1990s, states began banning open burning of household waste. The EPA classified backyard burning as a significant source of dioxins and particulate matter. By 2005, open burning was illegal or tightly restricted in 38 states. The regulations were not wrong about air quality, but they were written without a single thought about the family living 12 miles from the nearest paved road, who now had to pay $45 a month for trash pickup they could not afford. Many of those families just started driving their garbage to illegal dump sites instead. The burn barrel was simple. The replacement was not. Your grandmother had rain barrels under every gutter downspout on the farmhouse. Cedar barrels, later plastic drums, caught thousands of gallons a year. That water went into the garden, the livestock troughs, the root cellar cooling system, and during dry spells into the washing machine. Nobody asked permission. Nobody filed paperwork. Water fell from the sky onto your roof, and you caught it. Starting in the 1970s, Western states began enforcing prior appropriation water laws that technically made rainwater collection illegal without a permit. Colorado did not fully legalize residential rain barrel collection until 2016. Utah restricted it until 2010. In parts of Oregon, a man was sentenced to 30 days in jail in 2012 for collecting rainwater on his own property without a permit. The legal theory was that rainfall belonged to the state because it would eventually feed streams and rivers that were already allocated. Your grandmother catching rain off the barn roof was, according to state law, stealing water from downstream users she had never met. Most Western states have since relaxed these laws, but for decades, the simplest, most ancient water conservation practice on Earth was treated as a crime. Number 16, home slaughter of livestock for personal use without inspection. Your great-grandfather did not call a USDA inspector when he slaughtered a hog in November. He called his brother-in-law and his neighbor. 3 men, a sharp knife, a gambrel, and a scalding pot in the yard. By noon, the hog was broken down into hams, shoulders, chops, and belly. The women inside were already grinding sausage and rendering lard. This is how every farm family in America processed meat from the founding of the Republic until the mid-20th century. Federal law still technically allows home slaughter for personal consumption, but state laws have layered so many restrictions on top that the practice has become effectively illegal in many jurisdictions. You cannot sell or give away the meat in most states without USDA inspection. Some states require you to notify the county before slaughter. Others restrict where on your property you can do it. Zoning laws in formerly rural areas that have been reclassified as residential have made backyard slaughter a code violation punishable by fines. The knowledge of how to break down a hog is vanishing with the generation that did it without thinking. Butcher shops now charge $200 to $400 to process a single pig. Your grandfather did it for free because he knew how. First, pattern break. Here is where the story gets uncomfortable. The regulations that banned these farmhouse practices were not passed by farmers. They were passed by state legislatures, influenced by industry groups who stood to profit when self-sufficient families were forced to become consumers. Every trick on this list has the same structure. A family does something for free. An industry offers to do it for a price. The industry lobbies to make the free version illegal. Then the industry raises the price. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented in state legislative records from the 1970s through the 1990s. The American Farm Bureau Federation, the National Milk Producers Federation, and half a dozen chemical company trade groups submitted testimony supporting the regulations that made these practices illegal. They did not argue that the practices were dangerous. They argued that the practices were unregulated. And unregulated, in their language, meant unprofitable for anyone except the family doing it. Number 15, selling home-canned goods at farmers markets. Your grandmother's pantry shelves held 200 jars of tomatoes, green beans, pickles, jams, and apple butter. She canned all summer and sold the surplus at the church bazaar, the county fair, and the roadside stand at the end of the driveway. Nobody asked for a license. Nobody tested the pH level. Nobody from the health department drove out to inspect her kitchen. People bought her bread and butter pickles because they had been buying them for 20 years, and nobody had ever gotten sick. Beginning in the 1990s, states began enforcing cottage food laws that restricted what home canners could sell, where they could sell it, and how much they could earn. Most states now prohibit the sale of home-canned low-acid foods like green beans and corn entirely. Some states cap cottage food sales at $25,000 or even $5,000 per year. Many require commercial kitchen rental, liability insurance, and annual inspections. The woman selling 6 jars of tomato sauce at the Saturday market now faces the same regulatory burden as a food manufacturing plant. Many stopped selling entirely. The jars still line the basement shelves, but the knowledge of how to do it, the confidence to feed your neighbors from your own kitchen, is fading with every passing year. Number 14. Using well water without annual testing. Every farmhouse in America drew water from a hand-dug or drilled well. Your grandfather primed the pump, filled the bucket, and drank without wondering what was in it. The water was cold, mineral-rich, and tasted like the earth it came from. Families used the same well for generations. They knew the water was good because they had been drinking it their entire lives. Starting in the 1980s, states began requiring annual water testing for private wells, particularly when properties were sold. Some states now mandate testing for coliform bacteria, nitrates, arsenic, and lead at costs ranging from $100 to $500 per test. Mortgage lenders require passing results before approving loans on rural properties. If your well fails a test, you can be required to install filtration systems costing $3,000 to $10,000, or drill a new well for $15,000. The testing itself is not unreasonable. Contaminated water is genuinely dangerous, but the regulatory framework turned a free, self-sufficient water source into an ongoing financial obligation. Your grandfather's well cost $200 to dig in 1955 and provided free water for 50 years. The same well today requires annual testing, potential remediation, and regulatory compliance that costs more per year than the well cost to build. Number 13. Outhouse use on rural property. This is the one nobody wants to talk about. Outhouse. The outhouse served rural America for 3 centuries. A simple pit, a wooden structure, a bag of lime. When the pit filled, you dug a new one and moved the building. The old pit composted naturally over several years, returning nutrients to the soil. No plumbing, no septic system, no water usage. A new outhouse could be built in an afternoon for less than $50 in materials. By the 1970s, county health codes began requiring septic systems or connection to municipal sewer for all inhabited structures. Outhouses were outlawed in most jurisdictions by the 1990s. Installing a modern septic system costs between $10,000 and $30,000, depending on soil conditions and local requirements. That single regulation priced thousands of rural families out of legally inhabiting their own property. In parts of Appalachia and the rural South, families who had lived on the same land for 5 generations were suddenly in violation of county health codes for using the same sanitation method their great-great-grandparents used. Some states offered grants, most did not. The outhouse was not elegant, but it worked, and replacing it cost more than some families earned in a year. Number 12. Disposing of gray water in the garden. Every farmhouse kitchen had a slop sink or a back door where dishwater, bathwater, and laundry water went straight out into the garden. Your grandmother washed dishes with lye soap and hot water, carried the basin to the back step, and flung it across the tomato patch. The soapy water kept certain pests away. The moisture kept the garden growing through dry spells. Nothing was wasted, not even dirty water. State plumbing codes adopted between the 1970s and the 1990s classified all household wastewater as sewage, requiring it to flow into an approved septic system or municipal sewer. Gray water diversion, the practice of routing sink and laundry water to outdoor irrigation, became illegal in most states without a permit and an approved gray water system that could cost $2,000 to $5,000 to install. A few states like Arizona and Texas have since created simplified gray water permits. But in most of the country, throwing your dishwater on the garden is technically a plumbing code violation. Your grandmother did it every day of her life. Second pattern break. Here is what connects every item on this list. Self-sufficiency became illegal, not all at once, but piece by piece. No single regulation destroyed the farmhouse way of life. It was death by 1,000 permits. Each rule seemed reasonable in isolation. Test your well water, inspect your septic system, license your food sales. But taken together, they created a regulatory environment where living the way Americans lived for 200 years became either illegal or prohibitively expensive. The family farm did not die because farming stopped working. It died because the cost of compliance exceeded the income from the land. A farm family in 1955 needed almost nothing from the outside economy. They grew food, raised meat, caught water, heated with wood, and disposed of waste on their own property. By 2005, that same family needed permits, inspections, licenses, insurance, and annual testing fees that could total $5,000 a year before they planted a single seed. Number 11. Burning brush and clearing land with fire. Every spring and fall, your grandfather set controlled burns across his property. He burned brush piles, fence rows, ditch banks, and old pasture to clear dead growth and encourage new growth. The ash fertilized the soil. The fire killed parasites and invasive weeds. Native Americans had managed land with fire for thousands of years before European settlers arrived and continued the practice. By the 1980s, open burning permits became mandatory in most states. Many counties banned agricultural burning entirely, particularly near expanding suburban areas. Violations carry fines ranging from $500 to $10,000. In some jurisdictions, an escaped controlled burn can result in criminal charges and liability for any property damage, even if the fire was set following traditional practices used safely for generations. Ecologists now recognize that fire suppression has contributed to catastrophic wildfires, invasive species spread, and declining grassland health across the country. The controlled burns your grandfather performed for free are now being reintroduced by state conservation agencies at taxpayer expense. They hire contractors. They write environmental impact assessments. They spend $500 per acre to do what your grandfather did with a book of matches and a rake. Number 10. Keeping backyard chickens in town limits. Your grandmother kept 6 hens in a coop behind the garage in a town of 4,000 people. Nobody complained. The hens ate kitchen scraps and produced enough eggs to feed the family and trade with neighbors. The rooster crowed at dawn, and everyone was already awake anyway because they had jobs that started at 6 in the morning. Between the 1950s and the 1990s, municipal zoning ordinances across America quietly banned backyard poultry in residential areas. The suburban expansion that followed World War II brought a new idea of what a neighborhood should look like, and chickens did not fit the image. Towns that had kept chickens for a century suddenly declared them a nuisance. Fines ranged from $50 to $500 per violation. Some cities treated backyard hens the same as livestock, requiring agricultural zoning that existed nowhere within city limits. The urban chicken movement that started around 2008 was celebrated as innovative and progressive. It was actually just people asking permission to do what their grandmothers never needed permission for. Number 9. Making and selling lye soap. Your great-grandmother made soap once a year. She saved wood ash all winter, leached it with rainwater to make lye, and combined it with rendered tallow or lard in a big iron kettle outdoors. The chemical reaction, saponification, produced a hard, clean soap that washed everything from dishes to children without any synthetic ingredients. She cut it into bars and sold the extras at the general store. Today, homemade soap sold to the public must comply with FDA cosmetic labeling regulations if any cleaning or beautifying claims are made. If the soap makes therapeutic claims, it falls under drug regulations. State regulations add further layers, such as commercial kitchen requirements, liability insurance, and ingredient sourcing documentation. The regulatory burden for selling a bar of lye soap now rivals that of launching a pharmaceutical product. Your great-grandmother's entire annual soap production would not cover the cost of compliance. She made soap from waste products that cost her nothing. The soap aisle at the grocery store now charges $6 a bar for products that contain petroleum derivatives she would not have recognized. Number 8. Composting livestock manure near a waterway. On every working farm in America, manure went back to the fields. Chicken litter, cow patties, horse droppings, all of it was collected and composted in piles near the barn, then spread across gardens and crop fields as fertilizer. It was the original closed-loop system. The animals ate the crops fed the soil, and the soil grew more crops. Your grandfather's manure pile sat 30 feet from the creek and had been there since his father built the barn in 1921. Starting in the 1990s, state environmental agencies began enforcing setback requirements for manure storage near waterways. The Clean Water Act and subsequent state regulations established buffer zones of 100 to 300 feet between manure composting operations and any waterway, including seasonal streams and drainage ditches. Farms that had operated the same way for decades were suddenly in violation. Compliance meant moving infrastructure, installing containment systems, and filing nutrient management plans that required professional consulting fees. Meanwhile, the chemical fertilizer industry sold 22 million tons of synthetic nitrogen to American farmers in 2023 at prices that make manure composting look like an inconvenience rather than a resource. The most sustainable farming practice in human history became a regulatory headache. The most polluting one stayed on the shelf at the farm supply store. Number 7. Selling eggs from the farm without a license. Your grandmother's egg money was real money. It paid for shoes, fabric, school supplies, and Christmas presents. She collected eggs every morning, wiped them with a dry cloth, placed them in cartons saved from the store, and sold them to anyone who drove down the lane. No washing required, no refrigeration necessary. The natural bloom on an unwashed egg protects it from bacteria for weeks at room temperature. Most European countries still sell eggs this way. But in the United States, state regulations now require egg sellers to obtain licenses, submit to inspections, grade their eggs, and in many states, wash and refrigerate them before sale. Washing actually removes the protective bloom and makes eggs more vulnerable to contamination, which is why they then require refrigeration. We created a problem and then regulated the solution. Some states exempt small producers with fewer than 3,000 hens. Others set the exemption at 150 hens, or none at all. The paperwork, licensing, and facility requirements for selling a dozen eggs from a farm stand have turned a simple exchange between neighbors into a regulated commercial transaction. Third pattern break. Here is what the regulations never accounted for: trust. When your grandmother sold eggs to Mrs. Henderson down the road, trust was the inspection system. Mrs. Henderson had been buying eggs for 15 years. She knew the hens. She knew the farm. She knew that if something was wrong, she could walk a quarter mile and say so. That relationship was the most effective food safety system ever invented. It was local, immediate, and self-correcting. No inspector needed. No license required. Regulations replaced trust with paperwork. They replaced relationships with compliance certificates. They replaced a system that had worked for centuries with one that cost billions of dollars to administer, and that still fails regularly. Every major food safety recall in the last 20 years came from a facility inspected by the USDA, not from a grandmother's egg basket. Number 6. Using homemade pesticides on crops. Your grandfather made his own pest control. Tobacco tea for aphids was made by soaking cigarette butts in water overnight, then spraying the brown liquid on plants. Wood ash was dusted on squash vines to repel beetles. Boric acid mixed with sugar controlled ants. Sulfur was dusted on grapevines for mildew. Milky water was sprayed on roses for black spot. These formulations cost almost nothing and were passed between farmers the way recipes were passed between wives. Beginning in 1972, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act was amended to require registration of all pesticides, including homemade formulations used on commercial crops. While home gardeners can still technically use homemade remedies on their own produce, selling produce treated with unregistered pesticides is a federal violation. The practical effect was to push every commercial grower toward registered chemical products sold by companies like Monsanto, Dow, and DuPont. Chemical companies lobbied hard for strict pesticide registration requirements. Internal documents from industry trade groups show coordinated campaigns to frame homemade pest control as dangerously unregulated. Tobacco tea worked, wood ash worked. They still work. But the companies that sell $40 billion worth of pesticides a year prefer that you do not know that. Number 5, building structures without a permit. Your grandfather built his own barn, his own chicken coop, his own smokehouse, his own root cellar, and his own tool shed. He did not ask anyone. He did not file plans. He did not pay fees. He needed a building, so he built one. The materials came from the lumber mill 10 miles away, or from trees he felled on his own property. A barn raising was a community event. Neighbors showed up. Walls went up. The job was done in 2 days. Modern building codes adopted in waves from the 1970s through the 2000s require permits for virtually any structure, including agricultural buildings in many jurisdictions. Permit fees, plan reviews, engineering stamps, and required inspections can add $5,000 to $20,000 to the cost of a simple outbuilding. The regulations exist to ensure structural safety, which is reasonable for houses and commercial buildings. But applying the same framework to a 200-square-foot chicken coop or a firewood shed means that the cost of the permit can exceed the cost of the building. Families who built their own infrastructure for 200 years are now hiring contractors and paying engineers to do what their grandfathers did with a saw and a level. Number 4, heating exclusively with wood without emissions compliance. Your grandfather heated the entire farmhouse with a single wood stove, a cast iron box that burned oak and hickory splits he had cut, split, and stacked himself the previous summer. The wood was free. The stove cost $40 in 1955 and lasted 30 years. He never paid a heating bill in his life. The house smelled like wood smoke from October to April. Beginning in 1988, the Environmental Protection Agency began regulating wood stove emissions. New regulations require stoves that are certified and that meet particulate emission standards. In some states, selling or installing a wood stove that is not certified is illegal. Several counties have banned wood burning entirely during air quality alert days, even in rural areas where wood is the primary heat source. A new wood stove certified by the Environmental Protection Agency costs $2,000 to $4,000. Installation runs another $1,000 to $3,000. For a rural family that heats with wood because they cannot afford propane, which costs $3.50 a gallon, those compliance costs represent a financial impossibility. The regulation assumes that everyone has access to alternative heating. They do not. Some families in rural Appalachia and the Mountain West face the choice between burning wood illegally and freezing legally. Number 3, burying deceased livestock on the property. When a cow died on the farm, your grandfather dug a hole with the tractor, rolled the animal in, and covered it. The next season, he planted over it. That was the system. It was practical, immediate, and free. The nutrients returned to the soil. There was no hauling a 1,200-pound carcass to a rendering facility 60 miles away. State environmental and agricultural regulations now restrict or prohibit on-farm burial of livestock in the majority of states. Requirements include minimum burial depths, setbacks from wells and waterways, and in some states, mandatory reporting to the state veterinarian. Violations can carry fines of $1,000 or more per incident. The approved alternative, hiring a rendering service or transporting the carcass to an approved disposal facility, costs $200 to $800 per animal. For a small farmer who loses a cow to illness, that disposal cost can exceed the value of the animal. The regulation was designed to prevent groundwater contamination and disease spread, which are legitimate concerns in concentrated animal operations. But applied to a single cow on a 200-acre farm with no neighbors for half a mile, it solves a problem that does not exist. The farm stand was the original direct-to-consumer marketplace, a table at the end of the driveway, a hand-painted sign. Whatever came out of the garden that morning, tomatoes, sweet corn, squash, peppers, peaches, watermelons, maybe some canned goods and baked items alongside. No cash register, no sales tax collection, no health permit. An honor box for payment when nobody was home. Between the 1980s and the 2000s, state and county regulations progressively tightened requirements for roadside farm sales. Health department permits, sales tax licenses, liability insurance, hand washing stations, overhead cover requirements, and approved surface materials for display tables became common. The cost and complexity of compliance turned a card table and a bushel of tomatoes into a small business filing. Many farm stands simply closed. The ones that remain are operated by farms large enough to absorb the regulatory overhead. The small farmer with a surplus garden, the original farm stand operator, has been regulated out of existence. Number 1. Saving and sharing seed without restriction. This was the most fundamental agricultural practice in human history. Your grandmother saved seed from this year's best tomatoes, dried them on the kitchen windowsill, stored them in paper envelopes in a coffee tin, and planted them the following spring. She traded seed with neighbors at church, and she mailed packets to relatives in other states. Every variety in her garden was selected over generations for flavor, disease resistance, and adaptation to local soil and climate. Beginning in the 1980s, the expansion of plant patents and the introduction of genetically modified seeds with licensing agreements fundamentally altered the legal landscape of seed saving. Utility patents on plant varieties, upheld by the Supreme Court in 2001, made it illegal to save and replant patented seed without permission. Large seed companies acquired smaller regional seed houses, narrowing the commercial availability of open-pollinated heirloom varieties. While saving seed from non-patented varieties remains legal, the practical reality is that the commercial seed supply is now dominated by patented and hybrid varieties that either cannot be legally saved or will not reproduce true to type. Your grandmother's coffee tin of tomato seed represented 10,000 years of agricultural knowledge freely shared between neighbors. The seed industry replaced that system with annual purchases, licensing agreements, and legal threats. The most self-sufficient act a farmer could perform, saving seed from a plant grown on their own land, became a potential lawsuit. Here is my challenge. Learn one of these tricks this week. Set up a rain barrel. Buy eggs from a neighbor who keeps chickens. Ask your grandmother how she made soap, or what she kept in that pantry before the regulations came. Then ask yourself one question. If these practices were so dangerous that they had to be banned, how did your family survive using them for 200 years? Because the truth is uncomfortable. Self-sufficiency was never the problem. Self-sufficiency was the competition. Share which one surprised you most in the comments. I want to know if the raw milk gets more debate than the seed saving. I want to know if anyone else's grandfather burned brush every spring without asking a soul, because these were not just tricks. They were a way of life that got regulated out from under us while nobody was paying attention.